Maya Lorington had rehearsed the email in her mind repeatedly before sending it, fully aware that this business trip could define her career, yet unaware that the real challenge would have nothing to do with the presentation she meticulously prepared. As she shut her laptop at the end of the day, her heart thudded against her ribs with an intensity she had not anticipated. She had worked at Braverton Technologies for nearly a year, spending every minute trying to prove she belonged in a world that demanded excellence at every turn. And being invited, personally invited, by the company's uncompromising CEO to accompany him on a 3-day investment retreat was both exhilarating and terrifying. Adrian Hale was known as the kind of leader people admired from afar, but never dared to approach. He was centered, precise, impossibly intelligent, self-contained to a fault, and carried a kind of quiet authority that made even senior executives straighten their posture around him. He walked through the building like a storm held inside a suit, powerful, focused, and impossible to read. And now she would be working alongside him, representing the company at one of the most important corporate gatherings of the year. She tried to sleep that night, but the thought of spending days in close proximity to a man who barely spoke outside of work left her staring at her ceiling long past midnight. She admired him. Everyone admired him, but admiration turned into pressure when she realized how much rested on her performance. She had risen from a modest background, earning scholarships, taking 2 part-time jobs, and building her career from nothing but determination. This trip was her chance to show she was more than an analyst lost inside spreadsheets, that she could think strategically, speak confidently, and command a room when needed. She kept repeating that to herself, reminding herself that she had earned this opportunity. Yet each time she imagined stepping onto the plane beside him, her stomach twisted into knots of anticipation. The next morning, arriving at the company lobby before sunrise, she felt the weight of her nerves settle heavily on her shoulders. She clutched the handle of her suitcase, willing her expression into something that would appear calm and capable, rather than overwhelmed. The building felt unnaturally quiet at that hour, and she found herself pacing to the window just so she would not seem idle when he arrived. But when the elevator doors opened and Adrian stepped out with his usual calm composure, she froze for a moment, struck by how different he looked out of the office's fluorescent lights. His dark coat contrasted sharply against the pale marble floors, and his hair, usually perfectly styled, was slightly out of place, as if even he had rushed to get here on time. His gaze found her instantly, and though his expression remained professional, there was something in his eyes she had never noticed before. An acknowledgement, perhaps? Or the faintest recognition of her effort. "Maya?" he greeted her, voice smooth and measured. "Ready?" She nodded, hoping the tremor she felt inside did not reach her expression. He studied her briefly, not in a way that crossed boundaries, but in a way that seemed to assess whether she was truly prepared for what lay ahead. For a moment, she wondered if he could see through her carefully composed facade, if he could sense the nervous energy radiating from her. His voice softened slightly, almost imperceptibly. "You'll do well today," he said before turning toward the exit. The simple reassurance steadied something inside her that she did not realize was drifting. The car ride to the airport was quiet, but not uncomfortable. Adrian reviewed documents on his tablet, while Maya mentally rehearsed the data she would be presenting. Every now and then, she felt his gaze shift toward her, as though he was checking whether she was still composed, and each time he looked away just as quickly, leaving her wondering what he thought but never daring to ask. The flight followed a similar rhythm. Professional silence, occasional subtle glances, the unspoken pressure of shared responsibility weighing on both of them. Landing in Denver, however, introduced complications neither had anticipated. The hotel lobby was bustling with visitors arriving for the same retreat they were attending. When Adrian stepped to the reception desk, Maya watched a subtle tension settle into his posture. The clerk typed quickly, then frowned in a way that triggered immediate concern. "Sir," the woman said apologetically, "it appears your reservation was mistakenly merged. Instead of 2 rooms, we only have the single executive suite. The hotel is fully booked due to the summit. We're deeply sorry." Maya's heart dropped instantly. Sharing a suite, sharing a living space with her boss, was the last thing she wanted.
Her mind raced with every professional guideline she had ever memorized, every boundary she believed should remain firm. She braced herself for Adrian's frustration, but instead of reacting sharply, he simply exhaled, thoughtful. "That's not ideal," he said evenly, turning toward Maya with an expression she could not decipher. "If you're uncomfortable, I'll arrange alternate accommodations." His tone carried none of the detachment she expected from him. It held something else: respect, consideration, and an understanding of the awkwardness of the situation. She knew he meant it. He would absolutely make new arrangements, even if it complicated our schedule or cost extra. She also knew this trip mattered too much to let nerves dictate her decisions. "It's all right," she said, after a moment, keeping her voice steady. "If the suite has 2 separate spaces, we can manage." He held her gaze a little longer than usual, as if evaluating whether she was agreeing out of professionalism or pressure. She kept her eyes steady, willing him to see that she was choosing competence, not fear. The suite was undeniably spacious, filled with warm light from floor-to-ceiling windows that stretched across the far wall. The living area was divided from the main bedroom by a partial glass partition, offering separation but not distance. Adrian set his bag down and immediately gestured to the bedroom. "You take the bed," he said firmly. "I'll stay in the living room." Maya opened her mouth to protest. After all, he was the CEO, but he shook his head before she could speak. "You need proper rest. You're presenting tomorrow. This isn't a discussion." His tone was not stern, it was protective in a way she had never experienced from him. And though she felt a fresh wave of nerves, she nodded an acknowledgement. As she unpacked later, she caught herself glancing at the partition, aware of his presence on the other side, even when she could not see him. It wasn't discomfort, it was something unfamiliar, a heightened awareness she did not yet have a name for. They spent the evening reviewing their talking points, and Maya was surprised by how different Adrian seemed away from the office. He asked for her input frequently, listened deeply, and even adjusted his own approach based on her insights. There was a subtle shift in his demeanor, a softening she had not anticipated. And when he looked at her, really looked at her, she felt something inside her chest tighten in a way she tried to ignore. This trip was already reshaping her understanding of him, and she had no idea how much more it would change, but she sensed, instinctively, that nothing afterward would be the same.
Maya awoke earlier than expected the next morning, long before the alarm she set the night before. The soft glow of dawn seeped into the suite through the sheer curtains, painting the room in pale amber light. For a moment, she simply lay still, disoriented and wrapped in the silence of an unfamiliar space. Then memories returned. Denver, the conference, the suite, the unexpected closeness of sharing a living space with her enigmatic boss, and her pulse surged. She sat up slowly, grounding herself with a deep breath. Today was the day she presented the segment she had spent weeks preparing. Today was the day people far above her position would evaluate her capability and potential. Her inner voice, usually a ruthless critic, whispered every fear she had ever held about not belonging among the industry's brightest minds. But beneath the nerves, a small spark existed, flickering but real. A reminder that she had fought too hard to let doubt overpower her now. She moved to the bathroom, catching a glimpse of herself in the mirror. Her hair partially tousled from sleep, faint circles under her eyes from insufficient rest, and a mix of anxiety and determination battled across her expression. She splashed cold water on her face, grounding herself in the physical sensation, and reminded her reflection quietly, "You earned this. You belong here. You're capable." As she stepped into the living room, she froze. Adrian was already awake, of course he was, standing near the window with a mug of coffee in hand, reviewing notes on his tablet. The early sunlight cast a warm glow across his features, softening the hard lines she was accustomed to seeing in the office. He looked different here, without the rigid routine of their corporate environment surrounding him, and she found herself momentarily unsettled by the sight. Not intimidated, something else, something she tried not to name. When he turned at the sound of her footsteps, his expression shifted in a way she couldn't fully interpret. Not surprise, not formality, something like acknowledgement, something human and unguarded. "Good morning," he said, his tone lower and gentler than usual. "You're up early." She returned his greeting, and he handed her the second mug of coffee he had prepared without mentioning it.
The gesture caught her off guard. He wasn't the type to involve himself in small acts of consideration, at least not in the office. He was efficient, direct, purposeful. But the Adrian standing in this suite, offering her coffee silently, seemed touched by a different kind of awareness. For a moment, she wondered if he could sense how nervous she was, and whether this was his quiet way of easing her into the day. They reviewed the agenda together, and Maya felt her anxiety ease slightly as they discussed strategies and expectations. Adrian asked for her thoughts again and again, each time listening intently, adjusting his own talking points when her ideas provided stronger direction. That respect, genuine respect, not performative approval, steadied her more than she anticipated. As they prepared to leave, she caught him watching her with what looked strangely like concern. "You're quiet," he said, adjusting the cuff of his sleeve. "Are you feeling prepared?" She hesitated before answering. "Prepared, yes. Nervous? Also yes." Adrian nodded slowly, and instead of dismissing her fear, he held it with a level of seriousness she had never expected. Being nervous means you care about the outcome, but nerves don't determine ability. Competence does, and you have that. The reassurance struck her in a place deeper than pride. It hit the part of her that had always battled the echo of voices telling her she wasn't enough. When they arrived at the conference center, the energy in the building was electric. Executives, investors, founders, analysts, and media representatives filled the expansive lobby, voices blending into a low hum of ambition and industry urgency. Maya walked beside Adrian, acutely aware of the professional distance she needed to maintain, yet unable to shake the feeling of vulnerability that came from being seen beside someone like him. People greeted Adrian, respectfully, attentively, almost reverently, but many also glanced at her with curiosity, quietly assessing who she was and why she was with him. The pressure settled like weight across her shoulders. Adrian noticed, pausing before they entered the main hall. He leaned slightly toward her, not close enough to cross boundaries, but close enough that she could hear him clearly over the noise. "Don't shrink yourself just because the room is large. You're here for a reason." She held his gaze for a moment, letting those words anchor her before they stepped into the space where her future waited. The meeting began with a series of introductory discussions, followed by presentations from various companies pitching their innovative expansions for the coming year. As Maya observed other speakers, she realized something startling. She could recognize where some of them lacked depth, where their confidence overshadowed real data, where their presence depended more on charisma than substantive insight. She had substance. She had numbers. She had strategy. Maybe, she realized slowly, she underestimated herself more than anyone else ever had. When it was her turn, she felt her pulse thunder, but she walked to the front with deliberate steadiness. Adrian opened with an executive overview, then transitioned the floor to her. The moment he said, "Our lead strategist, Maya Lorington," she felt something inside her shift. He didn't say analyst, he didn't say assistant, he didn't say supporting staff. Lead strategist. He had elevated her publicly, without warning, without hesitation, without doubt. Her anxiety evaporated, replaced by clarity and a drive she didn't recognize at first. She began speaking, and the room quieted, not politely, genuinely. People leaned in. Executives took notes. Investors exchanged thoughtful glances. Her voice steadied as she moved from market analysis to user engagement projections, from behavioral economics to long-term scalability. She didn't rush. She didn't stumble. She didn't falter. For the first time in her career, she felt like she was struggling to be heard, but like she belonged at the center of the conversation. She wasn't performing. She was leading. When she concluded her presentation, there was a beat of silence, a heavy, evaluating moment before the applause rose, not loud or dramatic, but the kind that signified real approval, real respect. She exhaled slowly, grounding herself again as she met his eyes across the room. His expression was unreadable at first, stern, focused, but then something subtle broke through. Pride. Not the detached pride of an executive whose employee had done well, but something deeper, something that looked almost personal. It unnerved her. It unsettled her. It warmed something in her chest she wasn't ready to acknowledge yet. After the session ended, people approached her, asking questions, complimenting her clarity, admiring her strategic perspective.
Maya found herself fielding conversations she never imagined she'd be having at this stage in her career. Adrian watched from a distance at first, giving her space to shine without overshadowing her. When they finally stepped aside together for a brief lunch break, she felt lighter than she had in years. He didn't begin with congratulations. Instead, he asked, "How do you feel?" She hesitated, then laughed softly. Proud, relieved, a little overwhelmed. He nodded, a faint smile appearing. "Good. That means you stepped into the space that was waiting for you." They walked outside the conference center to a quieter courtyard nearby. The sunlight warmed the stone paths and glinted off the glass buildings. Maya breathed deeply, savoring the crisp air. She felt more grounded now, fully present in a way she hadn't been in months. Adrian stopped near a small fountain, crossing his arms as he studied her. "You surprised a lot of people today, including those who underestimated you." She met his gaze squarely. "Did you underestimate me?" His expression shifted slightly, something unguarded flickering through his eyes. "Not underestimate. I simply didn't realize the depth of your capability until now." The honesty in his voice unsettled her in a way she couldn't articulate. As they walked back towards the conference center, I sensed him watching her thoughtfully, not critically, not with professional assessment, with something else, something she dared not interpret yet. The rest of the afternoon passed in discussions, networking events, and informal sessions, each one reinforcing Maya's confidence, each one reminding her that she had finally stepped into the version of herself she had always hoped she could become. But as evening approached and they returned to the suite, her nerves resurfaced, not because of the day's events, but because the reality of sharing a living space with him felt different now. The air between them had shifted, not unprofessionally, but undeniably. And when he looked at her that night, it was no longer with the distant interest of a CEO assessing an employee. It was with the awareness of two people who could no longer pretend they hadn't seen something meaningful beneath the surface.
The sun had dipped below the Denver skyline by the time Maya and Adrian returned to their suite, leaving the city washed in a blend of deep blue shadows and glowing lights. The hallway was quiet, the soft hum of distant conversations fading the moment the door closed behind them. Maya released a slow breath, feeling the weight of an exhausting yet exhilarating day settle into her body. She set her folder down on the console table and ran a hand through her hair, trying to release some of the tension still clinging to her muscles. For a moment, she simply stood there, grounding herself in the stillness of the room. Today had been monumental. She had spoken to a room full of powerful people without faltering, had commanded attention, had earned respect on a level she had only dared to imagine. And yet, the moment she stepped into the suite, she became acutely aware of the other reality unfolding. The unfamiliar closeness between her and Adrian, the subtle shifts in their dynamic that she could no longer attribute to professional circumstances alone. Adrian moved past her, loosening his tie as he walked toward the window. He stood there for a long moment, hands in his pockets, his posture relaxed in a way she rarely saw at the office. The city lights reflected on the glass, outlining his silhouette in a subtle glow. When he turned toward her, his expression was unreadable, more thoughtful than tired, as if he was still processing the day's events in his own way. "You handled yourself exceptionally today," he said. His voice was steady, but Maya sensed a layer of sincerity beneath the professionalism. She thanked him, but he shook his head slightly. "No, truly, you didn't just perform well, you outshined people with twice your experience. The room shifted when you spoke." She felt a strange flutter inside her, part pride, part disbelief, part something she wasn't ready to acknowledge. She had been so caught up in her nerves that she hadn't fully registered how strongly her presence had impacted the room until he said it. Hearing it from him mattered more than she expected. As she walked farther into the living room, she noticed how the space felt different tonight, heavier somehow, as if the energy between them had thickened. Adrian sat on the arm of the sofa, rolling his sleeves up to his elbows, revealing a side of him she rarely saw. The structured, polished CEO seemed to fall away in private, replaced by someone more human, someone who carried the weight of leadership with an exhaustion that was never visible in boardrooms. She found herself wanting to understand that version of him more deeply, and that realization unsettled her. To break the growing silence, she asked whether he felt the day had gone as he'd hoped.
Instead of answering immediately, he studied her, as if considering how much of his internal world he was willing to reveal. "It went better than expected," he said. "Not because of me, because of you, and I don't say things lightly." She sat on the opposite end of the sofa, maintaining an appropriate distance but feeling the tension between them like a quiet undercurrent. Adrian leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You've been undervaluing yourself," he said bluntly but not unkindly. "Not just in the office. Overall. You don't speak up unless someone asks. You don't push your ideas unless you're invited. You don't take credit even when it's obvious you deserve it." Maya blinked, taken aback. His voice wasn't reprimanding. It was concerned. He wasn't calling out weakness. He was exposing a truth she had always buried. She swallowed, unsure why his words felt so personal. He continued, softer this time. "You have strength, clarity, and vision, but you hide it because you're afraid of taking up space." She opened her mouth to respond, maybe to defend herself, maybe to question how well he could possibly know her, but the words wouldn't come. Because he wasn't wrong. She had spent most of her life trying not to be too much, trying not to draw too much attention to herself, trying to avoid mistakes because mistakes had consequences she couldn't afford. Her heart beat faster as she stared at him, suddenly feeling seen in a way she never expected. "I didn't realize you noticed," she finally whispered. Adrian gave a quiet half-smile, not amusement, but acknowledgement. "I noticed more than you think." Those 5 words shook her. She wasn't used to being noticed, not like that, not deeply, not intentionally. Before she could process it, Adrian stood and walked toward the kitchenette, opening a bottle of sparkling water and pouring 2 glasses. He handed one to her, his fingers brushing hers briefly, just a passing touch, but enough to send a sharp awareness rushing through her. She told herself it was just the exhaustion making her overly sensitive, but the truth lingered uncomfortably. Something between them had shifted, and neither of them seemed entirely willing to ignore it anymore. They talked for nearly an hour, not about work, but about background, ambition, struggle, and identity. Adrian revealed pieces of his life she hadn't expected him to share. How he had grown up in a demanding household where achievement was expected rather than celebrated. How he had spent years chasing success because he feared failure more than he valued fulfillment. And how leadership had isolated him more than empowered him. Maya listened quietly, realizing how much pressure he carried beneath the controlled exterior. She found herself wanting to understand that version of him more deeply. She found herself sharing pieces of her own story, growing up with limited financial stability, constantly pushing herself to excel because she feared slipping through the cracks, working harder than anyone around her because she couldn't rely on the privileges others took for granted. Their stories, different in upbringing, echoed each other in pressure and internal struggle. And as they exchanged vulnerabilities, something delicate formed between them. Trust. At one point, the conversation lulled into comfortable quiet, and they simply sat in the warm yellow glow of the room. The distance between them felt smaller now, though neither had moved physically. Her gaze drifted to the partial partition separating the bedroom from the living area, and a familiar knot tightened inside her. Sharing this suite was professional by circumstance, but it placed them in a level of proximity she wasn't accustomed to. She knew she had to sleep, to rest before the second day of meetings and workshops. Yet she hesitated, unsure how to excuse herself without drawing attention to the uneasy flutter in her chest. She finally rose from the sofa, smoothing her blouse, and said she should get some rest. Adrian nodded and stood as well, stepping a little closer than before but still respectful of boundaries. "You did well today," he repeated quietly, almost reverently. "I hope you recognize that." She thanked him, her voice softer than she intended. As she turned toward the bedroom, she felt his gaze following her, not inappropriately, but with a depth she wasn't prepared for. When she stopped at the doorway and glanced back, he was still watching her. Their eyes held for a long, suspended moment, longer than 2 people maintaining strictly professional boundaries would allow. Something unspoken passed between them, something she didn't dare to identify but couldn't deny. Then, as if sensing the danger of letting the moment stretch further, Adrian looked away first, giving her the space she didn't realize she needed. Maya retreated into the bedroom, closing the door gently behind her before leaning against it, her heart racing. She knew she had crossed into unknown territory. Not because of anything said or done, but because of everything they were both beginning to acknowledge internally. Lying in bed, she stared at the ceiling, unable to calm the whirlwind of thoughts. She wasn't naive. She understood workplace boundaries, career risks, and the importance of maintaining clean professional lines. She also understood that emotional clarity was essential to making wise decisions. But feelings were complicated, timing was unpredictable, and the man on the other side of the partition was no longer just her CEO, not in her mind and not in his tone, his gaze, or in the way he had spoken to her tonight. She rolled onto her side, pulling the blankets close, as if grounding herself. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, didn't know if this new tension would fade or intensify. But she knew one thing with certainty. Her life was shifting, her career was evolving, and the quiet connection forming between her and Adrian was something neither of them had expected and both of them felt.
The next morning arrived with a sense of quiet turbulence that Maya felt before she even opened her eyes. A sliver of daylight pressed through the curtain seams, carrying with it the subtle energy of a city already awake and alive. She sat up slowly, stretching the stiffness from her limbs as the reality of the day sank in. The conference wasn't over. There were still panels, workshops, and investor sessions that required both precision and confidence. Yet it wasn't the professional agenda that weighed most heavily on her mind. It was the subtle shift that had taken place between her and Adrian the night before. As she moved through the morning's preparations, she found herself replaying fragments of their long conversation, the way he had spoken with uncharacteristic openness, the way his eyes had softened in moments he probably didn't realize she had noticed. Something had changed, not explicitly, not dangerously, but undeniably. And she wasn't sure how to hold that truth within the rigid structure of professionalism she had always depended on. When she stepped out of the bedroom, she was startled to see Adrian already dressed in a crisp charcoal suit, adjusting his cufflinks with a focused expression that seemed almost rehearsed. But there was something different in the way he looked up when he noticed her. The faintest easing of his posture, a subtle warmth in his gaze, the quiet acknowledgement of the night before lingering like a shared secret. "Good morning," he said, his voice steady, composed, yet gentler than usual. She returned the greeting, and for a moment neither spoke. Instead, they shared a silent exchange of understanding, both fully aware of the thin, invisible line between them, and both equally cautious about crossing what should not be crossed. He handed her a well-prepared itinerary for the day, his fingers brushing hers unintentionally. The brief contact sent a small shock through her chest, but she maintained her composure, reminding herself that nerves were natural and that professionalism had to remain her anchor. The conference hall was even more crowded today, brimming with energy as attendees rushed between sessions. Maya walked beside Adrian, maintaining a respectful distance while still remaining close enough to discuss agenda items. She found herself observing him with a deeper awareness now, not just as her superior, but as a human being who, under all the layers of responsibility and guardedness, carried his own weight of expectations and vulnerabilities. He greeted a series of executives with poised authority, answering questions concisely, making decisions confidently. But every now and then, his gaze would drift toward her, checking that she was comfortable, prepared, and grounded. The silent consideration warmed her unexpectedly, almost dangerously. Their first session of the day involved a roundtable discussion with several high-profile investors. It was a more intimate setting, which made Maya's nerves spike. She sat beside Adrian as conversations unfolded around market performance, long-term projections, and technological innovation. Her mind raced with statistics, analysis, and insights she had studied thoroughly, but she hesitated to speak up, afraid to disrupt the flow. She felt Adrian glance at her, the subtle tilt of his head encouraging her without words. When she finally interjected with a point about demographic positioning and consumer behavior shifts, the room quieted slightly. One investor, a seasoned strategist with decades of experience, leaned forward, impressed. Questions followed, not dismissive or challenging, but genuinely curious. As Maya answered each one with confidence,
She felt her anxiety dissolve, replaced by the empowering realization that she deserved to be here. Adrian listened, occasionally elaborating on her insights, but always redirecting credit back to her. When the session ended, the lead investor approached both of them, turning to Maya first. "You have a sharp mind. Your analytical approach is refreshing. Keep developing it. It'll take you far." She thanked him, feeling her chest swell with pride. When he walked away, she turned to Adrian, who had been watching the exchange with a quiet, composed expression. "You're doing exactly what I expected, and I expect excellence." But beneath the professionalism in his tone, she sensed something else. Approval mixed with admiration, restrained yet present. By mid-afternoon, exhaustion settled into Maya's shoulders, but she pushed through, continuing to engage in discussions, take notes, offer ideas, and represent her department with increasing confidence. The conference schedule was demanding, but she found a rhythm that made the pressure manageable. During a brief break between sessions, Adrian guided her to a quiet lounge area away from the crowd. He handed her a bottle of water and gestured for her to sit. She hesitated, confused by the unexpected gesture of care. "You're starting to push yourself past your limit," he said simply. "You need to pace your energy." She smiled, surprised. "Do you always monitor your employees' stamina?" He shook his head, his expression unreadably soft. "No," he said quietly, "only the ones that matter." The statement landed deeply within her, sending a wave of warmth through her chest and leaving her momentarily speechless. She wasn't sure how to interpret his words, professionally, personally, or somewhere in the ambiguous space between them. Before she could respond, an announcement called them back to the main hall, saving both from the tension that briefly threatened to surface. But as they walked, Maya felt a quiet shift in her awareness. Adrian wasn't just her boss watching her performance. He was someone who saw her effort, her exhaustion, her worth, and cared enough to voice concern. She didn't know what to do with that truth, but she carried it with her nonetheless. The day continued with a whirlwind of discussions and collaborations until the final panel concluded near sunset. By then, Maya was mentally drained but fulfilled, proud of every contribution she had made. Adrian walked beside her as they exited the conference center, both moving in instinctive sync. The crisp evening air brushed against her face, grounding her after hours spent under artificial lighting. As they neared the hotel entrance, a light wind rustled her hair, and she reached up to tuck loose strands behind her ear. Adrian noticed and paused, his gaze lingering longer than necessary, not inappropriate but undeniably aware. He didn't speak immediately. Instead, he held the door open for her, his expression thoughtful as if he was weighing words he wasn't sure he should say. Back in the suite, Maya finally allowed herself to relax. She kicked off her shoes, sighing in relief as she sank into the sofa. Adrian loosened his tie and sat on the opposite side, although still closer than he would normally sit in the office. They shared a quiet moment, both mentally unraveling the weight of the day. "You exceeded expectations," he said eventually. "You didn't just represent the company, you elevated it." She smiled tiredly. "It feels surreal sometimes, like I'm stretching into a version of myself I didn't know I could be." Adrian nodded slowly. "Growth always feels foreign at first, but you belong in bigger spaces, Maya. You need to start seeing that." His words struck her deeply. Not flattery, but truth spoken with conviction. She swallowed the emotion tightening her throat. "It helps hearing that from someone who sets the standard," she admitted. He leaned back, watching her with an intensity that made her pulse stutter. "I set standards, but you met them on your own." His voice remained steady, but something shifted in his gaze, something earnest and unguarded. The silence that followed was not empty, but full of unspoken understanding, of mutual respect, of growing trust, of something neither was ready to define. Maya felt the complexity of the moment settle heavy in her chest. She knew the lines between them were delicate, easily misunderstood, and professionally risky. But she also knew she had never experienced this level of support, recognition, or connection in her career before. As she watched him, she wondered whether he felt the same undercurrent, whether he was just as aware of how their interactions were evolving beyond the rigid boundaries they had always maintained.
Eventually, she stood, saying she needed to prepare for tomorrow. Adrian nodded and rose slowly as well, moving slightly closer out of instinct before catching himself. He stepped back a fraction, maintaining distance, yet unable to hide the pull in his gaze. "Rest well," he said quietly, almost gently. She nodded, her heart tight with a complicated blend of gratitude and something she wasn't ready to acknowledge. She walked toward the bedroom, feeling his gaze follow her once again. Before closing the door, she turned slightly. For a moment their eyes met across the dimly lit room, bridging the space between them with a silent truth neither dared speak aloud. The door clicked softly behind her, and Maya leaned against it, releasing a breath filled with emotions she couldn't untangle. This trip had started as a test of her professional capabilities, but it had become something else entirely, an unfolding of identity, strength, connection, and possibility. She didn't know where it would lead, but she couldn't ignore the shift happening inside her, nor could she ignore the shift happening inside him.
The final morning of the retreat arrived with a quiet heaviness, the kind that came not from exhaustion but from the awareness that something was reaching its turning point. Maya awoke before sunrise, her thoughts drifting in slow, tangled waves as she lay in the faint glow of early light. The city outside was just beginning to stir, and the distant hum of traffic created a soft backdrop for the thoughts she could no longer outrun. She felt different, stronger, more certain of herself, more aware of possibilities she had never considered. But woven through that certainty was the delicate, unsettling awareness of the shift between herself and Adrian, an awareness that had grown with each shared moment, each vulnerable conversation, each unspoken glance. Yet today, more than ever, she knew she couldn't afford to lose her clarity. Her career was at a threshold, her future wide open, and she had to confront not only her ambition, but the emotional complexity that had emerged between them. She sat at the edge of the bed for several minutes before standing, grounding herself in the simple act of breathing deeply and reminding herself, "I have earned my place. I have control over my next steps. I choose my path." When she entered the suite's living area, she found Adrian already dressed, standing near the window with his jacket draped over the back of a chair. He was staring outside, his posture tense, in a way that suggested he was grappling with thoughts of his own. The morning light cast a pale glow across his face, highlighting the quiet conflict behind his composed expression. When he turned to her, there was a flicker of something. Relief? Hesitation? Introspection, all mixed together. "Morning," he said softly, his tone lacking its usual confident sharpness. She greeted him in return, and for a moment they simply stood there, neither moving, both silently acknowledging that this was not just another morning on a business trip. This was a moment of reckoning, personal and professional. The conference's final sessions were less formal, focused on open discussions, evaluations, and closing remarks. Maya walked beside Adrian through the bustling lobby, acutely aware of the professional expectations resting on her shoulders, but also aware of the quiet awareness still humming faintly between them. She stayed close, but not too close, maintained conversation, but not too casually, and rose to every discussion with confidence and clarity. Her insights continued to impress those around her, and more than once she was approached by professionals who wanted to connect after the retreat. Each time, Adrian stood to the side, not overshadowing her, not inserting himself, but observing with a look of subtle pride that warmed something inside her more than she was willing to admit. The most significant moment came near the end of the day, when the executive board member overseeing the retreat approached her privately. He praised her strategic clarity, her professionalism, and her ability to articulate complex concepts in understandable terms. Then he said something that sent her heart racing. "You should consider applying for the Regional Leadership Development Program. People with this level of insight should be on a path to management roles." Maya felt her breath catch. It wasn't just a compliment, but it was an invitation to level up, to expand, to step into the leadership world she had admired from afar. When she returned to Adrian with the news, his reaction startled her, not because he seemed surprised, but because he looked almost relieved.
"You deserve that opportunity," he said simply, and though his tone remained professional, she sensed the sincerity beneath it. The retreat finally concluded late in the afternoon, and they returned to the hotel one last time before their evening flight. The suite felt different now, as though it held the imprint of everything that had happened, the late-night conversations, the shifting awareness, the tension and trust building quietly between them. Maya sat on the sofa, her suitcase open nearby, packing her belongings slowly, methodically, giving herself space to think. Adrian stood by the desk, organizing his own items with an uncharacteristic lack of focus. The silence grew thick, not uncomfortable, but undeniably heavy with the conversation they both knew could no longer be avoided. When she finally zipped her suitcase and stood, she found him watching her. Not with intensity, but with a kind of quiet vulnerability she had seen only once before. "Maya," he began, stepping toward her with a measured pace, as if afraid of closing the distance too quickly. "There's something we should talk about before we return to the office." She nodded, bracing herself. He exhaled slowly. "I value professionalism, boundaries, structure. They've shaped who I am as a leader. But these last few days, something shifted. For me. And I don't know if it was intentional or unavoidable, but I can't pretend I didn't feel it." His honesty startled her, not because she hadn't sensed it, but because she never expected him to admit it. He continued, his voice controlled yet tinged with tension, "But I also know the implications. You're brilliant, driven. You're about to rise into opportunities that have nothing to do with me, and I refuse to be the reason your career path becomes complicated." Her heart tightened painfully. She had expected caution, professionalism, maybe even avoidance. She had not expected him to prioritize her future above anything. She stepped closer, her voice steady when she spoke. "I felt it too. I won't pretend I didn't. But I'm not confused about my priorities. I've worked too hard to jeopardize anything, and I know you would never put me in that position." Their eyes met in a moment of fragile, powerful honesty. Adrian's shoulders lowered, as if the weight he carried had eased slightly. "Then we choose clarity," he said, his tone quiet but resolute. "We acknowledge what we felt, but we move forward with respect and professionalism. We let time do its work, and when your career is no longer directly tied to me, when it's appropriate, we revisit the conversation, if it still matters." The gentleness in his voice made her throat tighten, not with sadness, but with something unexpectedly hopeful. Maya nodded, feeling the truth of his words settle deeply within her. "I agree, and I'm not afraid of that. Growth requires discipline and timing." The faintest smile touched Adrian's lips, a smile that held gratitude, admiration, and something softer that he couldn't voice. She took a slow breath, grounding herself in the clarity of their decision. What they had experienced wasn't fantasy, wasn't impulsive, wasn't reckless. It was human, honest, unplanned. And choosing boundaries didn't diminish its value, it protected it. Later that evening, as they boarded the plane home, they moved with a comfortable understanding, close enough to feel the connection, distant enough to honor the responsibility they both held. During the flight, Maya gazed out the window, reflecting on everything she had gained. She had stepped into her ambition without apology, had spoken with authority, and had been recognized for her brilliance. She had discovered a strength she hadn't known she possessed, and she had allowed herself to be seen, not just as an employee, but as a person with depth, integrity, and courage. She had handled emotional complexity with grace, and she was leaving the retreat with something even more valuable than professional opportunity: clarity of self. When they landed and stepped into the terminal, Adrian walked beside her, but allowed a respectful distance to settle between them as they approached the waiting car service. As they prepared to part ways, he turned to her, his expression composed but warm. "You have a future that's bigger than the version of yourself you brought into this trip," he said quietly, "and you're ready for it."
The words sank deep, anchoring into the very core of her identity. "Thank you," she replied softly, "for believing in me before I believed in myself." They shared a final moment of understanding, subtle, respectful, meaningful, before parting. As Maya stepped into her own car and watched the lights of the airport fade behind her, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Certainty. Not about Adrian, not about timing, not about the complexities that still lingered quietly in the background, but certainty about herself. She was stepping into a new season with confidence, strength, and clarity. And whatever the future held, professionally or personally, she would meet it with the same courage she had found on this unforgettable trip. This story wasn't about a romance. It wasn't about crossing lines. It wasn't about uncertainty. It was about growth, confidence, recognition, and two people choosing the right path at the right time. And Maya walked forward knowing that the greatest transformation had taken place inside her.